Section number 93 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea. Book 9, Chapter 2, Part 9, Conclusion. Retrospect. Defenders of the Inquisition, in the controversy over its suppression and since then have relied largely on the assertion that, during its existence, no voice was raised against it, that all organs of public opinion and all writers praised it as the protector of religion, and as extremely careful to administer exact justice. So far from this being the case, we have seen its own admissions, Volume 1, page 538, of the hearty hatred felt for it and its officials, and we have heard the complaints of the Cortes of Valladolid in 1518 and 1523, of Corunna in 1520, and of Madrid in 1575, besides the ceaseless struggles of Aragon and Catalina, whose Cortes had not been reduced to servility. What was its reputation throughout Europe may be gauged by the fact that in 1535, when Geo III was endeavouring to have an inquisition of his own in Portugal, and there was talk of referring the subject to the General Council, then expected shortly to assemble, his ambassador at Rome, Martinho, Archbishop of Funchal, warned him that if the matter was broached in the council, it would result in abolishing the Inquisition of Spain. In Spain, its reputation is to be gathered from the unbiased reports of the Venetian envoys, who lauded its services in the suppression of heresy, and to whom, as practical statesmen, it was an object of wonder and admiration, as a machine perfectly devised to keep the people in abject subjection. In these reports it is observable that, while all are emphatic to its rigour, not one hazards approval of its justice. The envoys were profoundly impressed by the universal awe which it inspired. As early as 1525, Gasparo Continari tells us that every one trembled before it, for its severity, and the dread entertained for it were greater even than for the Council of Ten. In 1557, Federico Baduro speaks of the terror caused by its pitiless procedure. In 1563, Paulo Tipilo, after dwelling on the secrecy and unsparing rigour of its judgments, says that everyone shudders at its very name, and as it has supreme authority over the property, life, honour, and even the souls of men. 2 years later, Giovanni Soranzo speaks of the great fear inspired by it, for its authority transcends incomparably that of the king. In 1567, Antonio Tipilo echoes these assertions, and all agree in their comments on the influence of the mysterious secrecy of its operation and the relentless severity of its action. It scarce needs this testimony to explain why no unfavourable opinion of the Inquisition is to be expected of Spaniards during its existence, except by those who spoke as mandatories of the people in the Cortes, or high officials in contests over competencias. Terror rendered silence imperative, and secrecy made ignorance universal. The discharged prisoner was sworn to reveal nothing of what he had endured, and any complaint of injustice subjected him to prosecution. Criticism was held to be impeding its action, and was a crime subject to condign punishment. Writers had ever to keep in view its censorship, with the certainty that any ill-judged word would ensure the suppression of a book, and any attempt at self-justification would lead to worse consequences, as Belando found when a petition to be heard cost him lifelong imprisonment and prohibition to use the pen. When, in the early Edict of Faith, everyone was required, under pain of excommunication, to denounce any impeding, direct or indirect, of the tribunal, or any criticism of the justice of its operation, restraint became universal and habitual, and, in the instinct of self-preservation, men would naturally seek to teach themselves and their children not even to think ill of the Inquisition, lest, in some unguarded moment, a chance utterance might lead to prosecutions and infamy. The popular refrain, "Con el rey y la Inquisición chiton," silence as to the king and the Inquisition, reveals to us better than a world of argument the result of this repression through generations, and its efficiency is seen in the fact that in Toledo, from 1648 to 1794, there was but a single trial for speaking ill of the Holy Office. Such training bore its fruits when autocracy broke down under revolution, and the experiment of self-government was essayed. The Spaniard was taught not alone to repress his opinions as to the Inquisition, but to keep a guard on his tongue under all circumstances, not only in public but in the sacred confidence of his own family, for the duty of denunciation applied to husband and father, to wife and children. Early as 1534, the orthodox Juan Louis Vives complained to Eratosthenes that in those difficult times it was dangerous either to speak or to keep silent. The cautious Mariana tells us that the most grievous opposition caused by the introduction of the Inquisition was the deprivation of freedom of speech, which some persons regarded as a servitude worse than death. We have seen how seriously were treated even the most trivial and careless expressions, which could be tortured into disregard of some theological tenet or disrespect for some church observance, and it behooved everyone to be on his guard at all times and in all places. The yearly Edict of Faith kept the terror of the Inquisition constantly before every man, and was perhaps the most efficient device ever invented to subject a population to the fear of an ever-impending danger. No other nation ever lived through centuries under a moral oppression so complete, so minute, and so all-pervading. That the Inquisition inspired a dread greater than felt for the royal authority is illustrated by a curious instance, in which it was utilized for good in subduing a lawless community. In 1588, Lupus Martin de Govilla, Inquisitor of Barcelona, in a visitation came to Mont Blanc, where no inquisitor had been for many years. He found it a populous town, torn by factions so bitter that men were slain in the streets. Battles were fought in the plaza, and women at their windows were shot with arquebuses. After publishing the Edict of Faith, he discovered that witnesses were afraid to come to him through the streets, and, Regarding this as a contempt of the Inquisition, he issued a proclamation forbidding the carrying of arquebuses and crossbows, and his order was obeyed. He made an example of one offender by requiring him to hear mass as a penitent, banishing him and confiscating his arquebus, which quieted the people, so that the Inquisition could be carried on. Then a murder occurred, and the reiters procured from the viceroy full powers for him to pacify the town. By general agreement all placed themselves under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, as there was no safety under the royal, and they gave thanks to God that peace was restored, and that men could move around without arms. Godvilla went to Poblet. When news was brought him of another murder, he returned and imprisoned and penanced those guilty, who complained to the viceroy, but the Audiencia, after examination, dismissed the complaint, and this strange jurisdiction of the Inquisition seems to have continued for some 10 years. Before dismissing the impression produced by the severity of the Inquisition, it will not be amiss to attempt some conjecture as to the totality of its operations, especially as regards the burnings, which naturally affected more profoundly the imagination. There is no question that the number of these has been greatly exaggerated in popular belief, an exaggeration to which Llorente has largely contributed by his absurd method of computation, on an arbitrary assumption of a certain annual average for each tribunal in successive periods. It is impossible now to reconstruct the statistics of the Inquisition, especially during its early activity, but some general conclusions can be formed from the details accessible as to a few tribunals. The burnings without doubt were numerous during the first few years, through the unregulated ardour of inquisitors, little versed in the canon law, who seem to have condemned right and left, on flimsy evidence, and without allowing their victims the benefit of applying for reconciliation, for, while there might be numerous negativos, there certainly were few pertinacious impediments. The discretion allowed to them to judge as to the genuineness of conversation gave a dangerous power, which was doubtless abused by zealots, and the principle that imperfect confession was conclusive of impedience added many to the list of victims, while the wholesale reconciliations under the edicts of grace afforded an abundant harvest to be garnered under the rule condemning relapse. In the early years, moreover, the absent and the dead contributed with their effigies largely to the terrible solemnities of the Quemadero. Modern writers vary irreconcilably in their estimates, influenced more largely by subjective considerations than by the imperfect statistics at their command. Rogero coolly asserts as a positive fact that those who perished in Spain at the stake for heresy did not amount to 400, and that these were voluntary victims, who refused to retract their errors. Father Gams reckons 2,000 for the period up to the death of Isabella in 1504, and as many more from that date up to 1758. On the other hand, Llorente calculates that, up to the end of Torquemada's activity, there had been condemned 105,294 persons, of whom 8,800 were burnt alive, 6,500 in effigy, and 90,004 exposed to public penance, while up to 1,524 the grand totals amounted to 14,344, 9,372 and 195,937. Even these figures are exceeded by Amor de la Rio, who is not usually given to exaggeration. He assumes that, up to 1525, when the Moriscos commenced to suffer as heretics, the number of those burnt alive amounted to 28,540, of those burnt in effigy to 16,520, and those penanced to 303,847, making a total of 348,907 condemnations for Judaism. Don Melegres Martin, whose familiarity with the documents is incontestable, tells us that in Castile, during 1481, more than 20,000 were reconciled under the edicts of grace, more than 3,000 were penanced with the San Benito, and more than 4,000 were burnt, but he adduces no authorities in support of the estimate. End of section 93. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section number 94 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea. Book 9, Chapter 2, Part 10, Conclusion. Retrospect. The only contemporary who gives us figures for the whole of Spain is Fernando de Pulgar, secretary of Queen Isabella. His official position gave him facilities for obtaining information, and he scarcely veiled dislike for the Inquisition was not likely to lead to underrating its activity. He states at 15,000 those who had come in under edicts of grace, and at 2,000 those who were burnt, besides the dead whose bones were exhumed in great quantities. The number of penitents he does not estimate. Unluckily, he gives no date, but as his chronicle ends in 1490, we may assume that to be the term comprised. With some variations, his figures were adapted from subsequent writers. Fernandez only makes the general statement that throughout Spain indefinite number were burnt, and condemned, and reconciled, and imprisoned, and of those reconciled many relapsed, and were burnt. Imperfect as are the records, we may endeavor to test these various estimates by such evidence as is at hand respecting a few of the tribunals. In this we may commence with Seville, which was unquestionably the most active. The Inquisition had started there, as the centre of crypto-Judaism, as it was the most populous city of Castile, with nearly 500,000 inhabitants, and its unrivalled commercial activity rendered it peculiarly attractive to the conversos, while Isabella's Andalusian degree of expulsion must have largely increased the number of pseudo-proselytes. In 1524 there was placed over the gateway of the castle of Trinidad occupied by the Tribunal, an inscription of which the purpose is not entirely clear, but significantly that up to that time it had caused the abjuration of more than 20,000 heretics, and had burnt nearly 1,000 obstinate ones. This is probably an understatement, if we are to believe Fernandez, who asserts that in 8 years, from the founding of the Seville Tribunal up to 1488, it had burnt in person more than 700 heretics, besides many effigies of fugitives and an infinite number of bones. Those reconciled during the same period he estimates at 5,000. Still its activity must soon have greatly diminished, for, in 1502, Antoine de Lalaing, visiting the castle of Triana, describes it as containing more than 20 heretic prisoners, which he evidently regards as a large number, but which would argue a very moderate amount of persecution in view of the leisurely procedure that was becoming usual. There is therefore an apparent tendency to exaggerate the achievements of the Holy Office in the statement of its secretary, Zurita, some half-century or more later, that in Seville alone, up to the year 1520, there were more than 4,000 culprits burned and more than 30,000 reconciled and penanced, besides the numerous fugitives, and he adds that an author, very diligent in the matter, affirms these figures to be exceedingly defective, and that, in the archbishopric of Seville alone, there were condemned as Judaizing heretics, more than 100,000 persons, including those reconciled. Cardinal Contarini, when Venetian envoy in 1525, was evidently misled by this tendency to amplification when he describes the Inquisition as having made a slaughter of the New Christians impossible to exaggerate. Unfortunately, no authentic records have seen the light by which to test the accuracy of these varying estimates of the activity of the most destructive tribunal during the early period. It is otherwise with several of those that rank next to it in importance. For the province of Toledo, as we have seen, the first tribunal was established at Ciudad Real, where, its 2 years of existence, it relaxed in person 47 and effigy 98. Transferred to Toledo in 1485, its operations at first were energetic, but they diminished greatly towards the end of the century until, in 1501, it had a spasmodic period of activity through the discovery of La Moca de Herrera, Volume 1, page 186, a young Jewish prophetess, to whose numerous believers no mercy was shown, for those who had been reconciled thus incurred the penalty of relapse. The total operations of the Toledo Tribunal, from its origin in 1485 until 1501, amount to 250 relaxed in person, over 500 in effigy, about 200 imprisoned, and 5,200 reconciled under edicts of grace. Of the personally relaxed, nearly half, or 117, were followers of the prophetess, leaving only 139 ordinary Judaizers, and, of those imprisoned, about 140 may be accounted for in the same way. Saragossa was reckoned as one of the most deadly tribunals in Spain. Indeed, Llorente remarks that if he had taken it and Toledo as the basis of his calculations, he would have tripled the number of victims. For this we have the details of the 65 autos held from 1485 to 1502, furnished by the record printed in the appendix to Volume 1. Summarized, this gives the totals of 119 burnt alive, 5 quartered, beheaded, or strangled prior to burning, 3 bodies burnt, 29 effigies burnt, and 458 penanced. or an aggregate of 614. The Libro Verde de Aragon, moreover, gives us an official list of the residents of Saragossa, burnt from 1483 to 1574, in summarizing which it appears that, during these 92 years, the total of relaxations in person was 125, and in effigy 77, including 7 witches, 3 sorcerers, and 4 Protestants. Tabulation by years emphasizes the diminution of activity after the close of the 15th century. Barcelona is another important tribunal of which we have accurate statistics during its early years, furnished by the royal archivist Pierre Miguel Carbonell. From its foundation to the end of Torquemada's career in 1496, there were 31 autos celebrated in Barcelona, Tarragona, Lerida, Girona, Perpignan, Vich, Elm, and Balaguer. In these the totals are only 10 strangled and burnt, 13 burnt alive, 15 dead, and 430 burnt in effigy, 1 reconciled in effigy, 116 penanced with prison, and 304 reconciled for spontaneous confession. Valencia, of all the tribunals, was the one which best maintained its activity throughout the 16th century, owing to the dense Morisco population. We have a list of all persons imprisoned for heresy from the beginning in 1485 up to 1592 inclusive, amounting in all to 3,104, of whom 530 were contributed by the last 4 years, 1589 to 92, when the persecution of the Moriscos was particularly active. There is also an alphabetical list of persons relaxed from the beginning until 1593, unfortunately imperfect and ending with the letter N, but by adding 25% we can obtain a reasonably close approximation to the total. The list as we have it gives 515 relaxations in person and 383 in effigy, or, with the addition of 25%, 643 of the former and 479 of the latter, being nearly an average of 6 per annum of the former and 4.5 of the latter. Valladolid had the most extensive territory of all the tribunals, but it comprised the northern provinces where the New Christians were comparatively few. It was not organized for work until 1488, making its first arrest on September 29th of that year, and holding its first auto on June 19th, 1489, when, after 9 months' work on new ground, there were but 18 relaxations in person and 4 in effigy. The next auto recorded did not occur until January 5th, 1492, when the relaxations in person numbered 32, and in effigy 2. This, while sufficiently cruel, indicates that the victims in the northern provinces bore but a small proportion to those in the southern. At the other extremity of Spain was the little tribunal of Majorca, which acquired a sudden and sinister reputation by the occurrences of 1678 and 1691. It started in 1488, and for some years was fairly active, lapsing in time into virtual torpor, as far as persecution was concerned, so that, including its autos of 1678 and 1691, the whole aggregate of its work for over 2 centuries amounted to 139 relaxations in person, 482 in effigy, and 637 reconciliations. in addition to 338 reconciled under edicts of grace in 1488 and 1491. In the latter periods there are records which enable us to reach a fairly accurate computation of the activity of some at least of the tribunals. A few of these I have had the opportunity of consulting, and the researches of future students will doubtless in time compile tolerably complete statistics for the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Inquisition, after the Suprema had compelled the tribunals to render periodical reports. We have those of Toledo from 1575 to 1610, not wholly complete, for the auto of 1595 is omitted, and the MS breaks off at the commencement of that of 1610. Toledo at the time was the most important tribunal in Spain, for it included Madrid, yet during these 35 years the relaxations amount to only 11 in person and 15 in effigy, so that, allowing for the omissions, there may have been one in person every 3 years, and one in effigy every 2 years, while the various penances number in all 904. Small as are these results, they continued to diminish. For the same tribunal we have a record extending from 1648 to 1794, and, during this century and a half, there were only 8 relaxations in person and 63 in effigy, the latest execution occurring in 1738. This gives us an average of one of the former every 18 years, and one of the latter every 2 years and a quarter. In addition, there were 1,094 penanced in various ways. It is true that about 1650 a separate tribunal was erected in Madrid, but a list of relaxations there, from its foundation up to 1754, when relaxation had virtually become obsolete, gives us only an aggregate of 19 in person and 16 in effigy, or 1 in every 5 years of the former and in 6 years of the latter. During the height of the renewed persecution of Judaizers in the 18th century, in the whole of the 64 autos celebrated throughout Spain from 1721 to 1727, the total number of relaxations was 77 in person and 74 in effigy, making an average of about 11 a year of each class. A grim record enough, but vastly less than has been popularly accepted. Nor must it be forgotten that, in the vast majority of cases, the victim was mercifully strangled before the fire was set. We have seen how very small was the proportion of impediments who persevered to the last and refused to earn the garrote by professing conversion. End of section 94. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section 95 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea. Book 9, Chapter 2, Part 11. Conclusion. Retrospect. The material at hand as yet is evidently insufficient to justify even a guess at the ghastly total. Yet, after all, it is not a matter of as much moment as seems to have been imagined, to determine how many human beings the Inquisition consigned to the stake.
how many bones it exhumed, how many effigies it burnt, how many penitents it threw into prison or sent to the galleys, how many orphans its confiscations cast penniless on the world. The story is terrible enough without reducing it to figures. Its awful significance lies in the fact that men were found who conscientiously did this, to the utmost of their ability, in the name of the gospel of peace and of Him who came to teach the brotherhood of man. It is enough to know that the inquisitors used their utmost efforts to stamp out what they deemed heresy, and the tale of their victims is not the gauge of their cruelty, but of the number of heretics whom they could discover. Save when pride or stupidity or ambition may have been the impelling motive, the men are not to be blamed, but the teaching which gave them such a conception of duty, so relentlessly performed, and framed a system of procedure which shrouded their acts in darkness and deprived the accused of his legitimate means of defence. The good cura de la Palacio was evidently a kindly-natured man, but he declares that the fires lighted by the Inquisition shall burn to the very heart of the wood, until all Judaizers are slain and not one remains, even to their children if infected with the same leprosy. In the hurried work of the early period there was no effort made to induce the conversation that would save the accused from the stake, but in later times the persistent labor bestowed on the condemned during the 3 days prior to the auto is evidence that the tribunals did not act through thirst of blood, and that they were sincerely desirous to save both the body and soul of the heretic, in the same spirit that torture was sometimes pitilessly administered in order to confirm the sufferer in the faith. Still at times there was doubtless a certain pride in affording to the populace the spectacle of a relaxation, and thus demonstrating the authority of the Holy Office. That the public should relish the entertainment thus provided was natural, both from the inherent attraction which the sight of suffering has for a certain class of minds, and from the assiduous teaching that heresy was to be exterminated, and that slaying of a heretic was acceptable offering to God. The Inquisitor Lorenzo Flores relates that at the great Valladolid auto of 1609, where there were 70 penitents, many of them reconciled or sentenced to abjuration de vehementi, the people murmured because one condemned to relaxation had professed conversion in time and had thus escaped the stake, and there were many complaints that the auto was not worth the expense of coming to see. He adds that at Toledo, where there was no one relaxed, the people declared that the auto was a failure. There is something terrible in the fierce exultation which fanaticism experienced in the agonies of the misbeliever. Padre Garro, in his account of the Mallorquin auto of May 6, 1691, gloats with an exuberance which he knew would be shared by his readers on the agonies of the 3 impediments who were burnt alive. As the flames reached them, they struggled desperately to free themselves from the iron ring which clasped them to the stake. Rafael Benito Terongi succeeded in releasing himself, but to no purpose, for he fell sideways into the fire. His sister Catalina, who had boasted that she would cast herself into the flames, when they began to lick her, shrieked to be set free. Rafael Valls, who had professed stoical insensibility, stood motionless as a statue so long as only the smoke reached him, But when the flames attacked him, he bent and twisted and writhed till he could no more. He was as fat as a suckling pig, and burnt internally, so that, after the flames left him, he continued burning like a hot coal, and bursting open, his entrails fell out like those of Judas. Thus burning alive, they died, to burn forever in hell. Such were the lessons which the Church inculcated, and such was the training which it gave to Spain. So that the auto de fe came to be regarded as a spectacular religious entertainment on the occasion of a royal visit, or in honour of the marriage of princes. Incidental to this was the cruel perpetuation of ancestral disgrace, by the display of San Benitos in churches, which Philip II rightly reckoned as the severest of inflictions. It intensified the terror inspired by the Tribunal, which, with a word, can consign a whole lineage to infamy. It kept alive and vigorous the horror of heresy, and was aggravated by the statutes of limpieza. I hesitate to impugn the motives of those who were active in these terrible triumphs of faith, as they were fondly termed, and, as stated above, the efforts to induce conversion show that there was no absolute thirst of blood. Yet it is impossible, in reviewing the career of the Inquisition, not to recognize how powerful an adjunct to fanaticism was the profitableness of persecution. Had the Holy Office been a source of expense instead of income, we may reasonably doubt whether the ardour of Ferdinand and Isabella would have suffered for its introduction, and it certainly would have had but a comparatively short and inactive career. We have seen how closely Ferdinand watched its expenditures and endeavoured to keep down its cost, while enjoying the results of its productiveness, and how grudgingly the crown ministered to its necessities when aid was unavoidable. We have seen, moreover, how eagerly the Inquisition itself grasped at all sources of gain, how it was stimulated to convict its victims by the prospect of their confiscations, and how fines and penances were sealed, not by the guilt of the culprits, but by its necessities, how jealously it guarded its receipts, and how when it reeked of deception and mediacy, when there was attempt to investigate its finances. After all is said, the Inquisition was an institution with a double duty, the destruction of heresy and the raising of money to encompass that destruction, and there are not wanting indications that the latter tended to supersede, or at least to obscure, the former. We may well question the purity of zeal which provided punishments and disabilities for heresy, at the same time chaffered over the market price of commutations and dispensations through which those penalties could be evaded. Not only confiscation, but pecuniary penance and fines were a source of revenue provocative of continual abuse, and the rage for limpieza provided abundant opportunities for extortion. The filthy order of gain pervades all the active period of the Inquisition, and its comparative inactivity during its latter career may perhaps be attributed as much to the absence of wealthy heretics as to the diminishing spirit of intolerance. Various ingenious theories have been framed to relieve the Inquisition of responsibility for the remarkable eclipse of Spanish intellectual progress after the 16th century. It is one of the interesting problems in the history of literature that Spain, whose brilliant achievements throughout the Reformation period promised to make her as dominant in the world of letters as in military and naval enterprise, should, within the space of a couple of generations, have become the most uncultured land in Christendom, without a public to encourage learning and genius, and without learning and genius to stimulate a public. For this there must have been a cause, and no other adequate one than the Inquisition has been discovered to account for this occultation. Indeed, but for the effort to argue it away, it would seem superfluous to insist that a system of severe repression of thought, by all the instrumentalities of Inquisition and State, is an ample explanation of the decadence of Spanish learning and literature, especially when coupled with the obstacles thrown around printing and publication by their combined censorship. The tribulations of Luis de Leon and Francisco Sanchez illustrate the dangers to which independent thinkers were exposed. The great printing house of which Pontares was ruined by the exigencies of the Inquisition in the matter of the Vatable Bible. All a priori considerations cast the responsibility on the censorship of thought, whether printed or expressed verbally in what were known as propositions, and burden of proof is thrown upon those who deny it. Their reliance is on the fact that Isabella stimulated the development of Spanish culture, and, at the same time, established the Inquisition, which thus was in existence for more than a century before the decadence became marked. This is quite easily explicable. The Inquisition was founded to extirpate Jewish and Moorish apostasy. In this it long had ample work without developing its evil capacity in the direction of censorship, save in such a sporadic instance as Diego Deza's prosecution in 1504 of the foremost scholar of his time, Elio Antonio de Nebrija, for venturing to correct the errors of the Vulgate for the compulsion polyglot in the service of Ximenes, who protected him, and when Inquisitor General allowed him to resume his labors. With the advent of Lutheranism, there gradually commenced the search for errors. Crude indexes of condemned books were compiled. Reading and investigation became restricted. The Pragmatica of 1559 forbade education at foreign seats of learning, and an elaborate system was gradually organized for protecting Spain from intellectual intercourse with other lands, while at home every phrase that could be construed in an objectionable sense was condemned. For a while the men whose training had been free from those trammels persisted, in spite of persecution more or less severe, but they gradually died out and had no successors. In 1601 Mariana explained that he translated his history from the original Latin because there were few who understood that language. Such learning brought neither honor nor profit, and he feared the unskilfulness of those who threatened to undertake the task. It is true, however, that Latin was widely studied as essential to gaining place in church or state, but to the neglect of everything else. Fray Penelosa y Mondragon in 1629, while boasting of the 32 universities and 4,000 Latin schools, and of Spanish preeminence in the supreme science of theology, for which there were infinite rewards, admits that there were none for the other sciences and arts, which were not regarded with favor or estimated as formerly. The intellectual energy of the nation, diverted from more serious channels, continued through another period to exhibit itself in the lighter fields of literature, whose names of Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Tirso de Molina, Calderon de la Barrera, Oviedo de Villegas and others show of what Spanish intellect was still capable if it were allowed free play. Even those, however, passed away, and had no successors in the growing intellectual torpor created by obstreperous censorship, and a dreary blank followed which even the stimulation attempted by Philip V could not relieve. End of section 95. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. Section 96 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea. Book 9, Chapter 2, Part 12, Conclusion, Retrospect. To produce and preserve this torpor by repressing all dangerous intellectuality, Spain was carefully kept out of the current of European progress. In other lands the debates of the Reformation forced Catholics as well as Protestants to investigations and speculations shocking to Spanish conservatism. The human mind was enabled to cast off the shackles of the Dark Ages, and was led to investigate the laws of nature and the relations of man to universe and to God. From all this bustling intellectual movement Spain was carefully secluded. Short-sighted opportunism, seeking the turmoil which agitated France and England and Germany, might bless the institution which preserved the peninsula in peaceful stagnation, but the price paid for torpidity was fearfully extravagant, for Spain became an intellectual nonentity. Even the grand theologians and mystics disappeared from the field which they had made their own, and were succeeded by a race of probabilistic casualists, who sought only to promote and to justify self-indulgence. How intellectual progress fared under these influences may be estimated by a single instance. When, in England, Halley was investigating the periodicity of the comet which bears his name, in Spain learned professors of the universities of Salamanca and Saragossa were publishing tracts to reassure the frightened people by proving that the dreadful portent boded evil only to the wicked, to the Turk and the heretic. The perfect success of the Inquisition in its work is manifested in the contrast between the 18th and the early 16th century, as illustrated by the statement of Juan Antonio Mayans y Ciscar, that a cartload of the precious MSS bestowed by Ximenes on his University of Alea was sold to the fireworks maker Torrecilla for a display in honor of Philip V, and that several other similar collections had shared the same fate. Even after half a century of Bourbon effort to revitalize the dormant intellect of Spain, Father Rabago, the royal confessor, grudged the money spent on historiographers and academics. It was a pure gift, he says, for it yields no fruits. In fact, the awakening from intellectual stupor was slow, for Dom Clemencin tells us that there was less printing in Spain at the commencement of the 19th century than there had been in the 15th under Isabella. It is impossible not to conclude that the Inquisition paralyzed both the intellectual and the economic development of Spain, and it is scarce reasonable for Valera to complain that, when Spain was aroused from its mental marasmus, it was to receive a foreign and not to revive a native culture. The science of art and literature should thus be submerged was a national misfortune, but even more to be deplored were the indirect consequences. Material progress became impossible, industry languished, and the inability to meet foreign competition assisted the mistaken internal policy of the government in prolonging and intensifying the poverty of the people. Nor was this the chief of evils that sprung from keeping the mind of the nation in leading strings, from repressing thought, and from excluding foreign ideas, for the people were thus rendered absolutely unfitted to meet the inevitable change that came with the Revolution. To this, in large measure, may be attributed the sufferings through which Spain has passed in the transition from absolutism to modern conditions. We have thus followed the career of the Spanish Inquisition from its foundation to its suppression. We have examined its methods and its acts, and have sought to appraise its influence and its share in the misfortunes which overwhelmed the nation. The conclusion can scarce be avoided that its work was almost wholly evil, and that, through its reflex action, the persecutors suffered along with the persecuted. Yet who can blame Isabella, or Torquemada, or the Habsburg princes for their share in originating and maintaining this disastrous instrument of wrong? The Church had taught for centuries that implicit acceptance of its dogmas and blind obedience to its commands were the only avenues to salvation, that heresy was treason to God, its extermination the highest service to God and the highest duty to man. This grew to be the universal belief, and, when Protestant sects framed their several confessions, each one was so supremely confident of possessing the secret of the divine being and his dealings with the creatures that all shared the zeal to serve God in the same cruel fashion. The Spanish Inquisition was only a more perfect and more lasting institution than the others were able to fashion. As regards witchcraft, indeed, a more humane and rational one, for no one can appreciate the service which in this matter it rendered to Spain, who has not realized the horrors of the witchcraft trials in which Catholic and Protestant Europe rivaled each other. The spirit among all was the same, and none are entitled to cast the first stone, unless we except the humble and despised Moravian brethren and the disciples of George Fox. The faggots of Miguel Servet bear witness to the stern resolve of Calvinism. Lutheranism has its roll call of victims. Anglicanism, under Edward VI, in 1550, undertook to organize an inquisition on the Spanish pattern, which burnt Joan of Kent for Arianism, and the writ de Herito Comburendo was not abolished until 1676. Much as we may abhor and deplore this cruelty, we must acquit the actors of moral responsibility, for they but acted in the conscientious belief that they were serving the Creator and his creatures. The real responsibility can be traced to distant ages, to St. Augustine and St. Leo the Great and the Fathers, who deduced from the doctrine of exclusive salvation that the obstinate dissident is to be put to death, not only in punishment for his sin, but to save the faithful from infection. This hideous teaching, crystallized into a practical system, came in the course of centuries to be an essential feature of the religion which it distorted so utterly from the love and charity inculcated from the founder. To dispute it was a heresy, subjecting the disputant from the penalties of heresy, and not to enforce it was to misuse the powers entrusted by God to rulers for the purpose of establishing his kingdom on earth. In Spain, under peculiar conditions, this resolve to enforce unity of belief in the conviction that it was essential to human happiness here and hereafter led to the framing of a system of so-called justice more iniquitous than has been involved by the cruelest despotism, which placed the lives, the fortunes, and the honour not only of individuals but of their posterity in the hands of those who could commit wrong without responsibility, who tempted human fragility to indulge its passions and its greed without restraint, and which subjected the population to a blind and unreasoning tyranny, against which the slightest murmur of complaint was a crime. The procedure which left the fate of the accused virtually in the hands of his judges was rendered doubly vicious by the inviolable secrecy in which it was enveloped, a secrecy which invited justice by shielding its perpetrators and enabling them to make a parade of benignant righteousness. It was the crowning iniquity of the Inquisition that it thus afforded to the evil-minded the amplest opportunity of wrong-doing. History affords no parallel to such a skilfully organized system, working relentlessly through centuries. The inquisitors were men, not demons or angels, and when injustice and oppression were rife in the secular courts, it would be folly not to expect them in the impenetrable recesses of the Holy Office. If we had met with instances of kindliness and genuine desire to do right, we have incidentally encountered the opposite too often for us to doubt its frequency. That the rulers of the Inquisition recognized the danger of this and sought to diminish it by moral influences is evident from the admirable play of utterance of which, by a Carta Accordia of April 13th, 1600, was ordered daily after Mass at the opening of the morning session. This implored the Holy Spirit to fill their hearts and guide their judgments, so that they might not be misled by ignorance or favour, or be corrupted by gifts or acceptance of persons, that their decisions might be in unison with his will, so that in the end they may earn eternal reward by well-doing. Yet we might feel more confidence in the sincerity of this attempt to curb by moral influence the evil tendencies fostered by the system if there had been stern repression and punishment of official wrongdoing, instead of the habitual mercy which served as encouragement. After all, the great lesson taught by the history of the Inquisition is that the attempt of man to control the conscience of his fellows reacts upon himself. He may inflict misery, but in due time that misery recoils on him or on his descendants, and the full penalty is extracted with interest. Never has the attempt been made so thoroughly, so continuously, or with such means of success as in Spain, and never has the consequent retribution been so palatable and so severe. The sins of the fathers have been visited on the children, and the end is not yet. A corollary to this is that the unity of faith, which was the ideal statesman and churchman alike in the 16th century, is fatal to the healthful spirit of competition through which progress, moral and material, is fostered. Improvement was impossible as long as the Holy See held a monopoly of salvation, and however deplorable were the hatred and strife developed by the rivalry which followed the Reformation, it yet was of inestimable benefit in raising the moral standards of both sides, in breaking down the stubbornness of conservatism, in rendering development possible. terrible as were the wars of religion which followed the Lutheran revolt, yet were they better than the stagnation preserved in Spain throughout efforts of the Inquisition. So long as human nature remains what it is, so long as the average man requires stimulation from without as well as within, so long as progress is the reward only of earnest endeavor, we must recognize that rivalry is the condition precedent of advancement, and that competition is good works in the most beneficent sphere of human activity. End of section 96. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Section 97 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4 by Henry Charles Lea. Appendices 1 and 9, Abjuration of Joseph Fernandez de Toro, Bishop of Oviedo. Prayer recited daily at opening of morning session. Appendix 1, Abjuration of Joseph Fernandez de Toro, Bishop of Oviedo. Bellario de la Orden de Santiago, Libro 5, Folio 150. Ego Joseph Fernandez de Toro, olem episcopus ovetensis, coram sanctissimo in Christo Patre, et Domine nostro Domine Clemente Divina, providentia, papa undecimo humiliter, genuflexus vobis emissit, armis didi cardinalibus contra hereticam pravitatem generalibus inquisitoribus ei assistentibus sacrosancto Dei evangelia coram me posita manibus tangens sciens neminem salvam fieri posse extra elam fidem quam tenet credit profitur ac docit sancta catholica et apostolica romana ecclesia contra quam fatior et dolio me gravitur erasse quia tenui et docui respectue errores et heresies formalis ac domata contra veritatem eiustem es ecclesiae et perrepue quia tenui et credidi quod non peccaverem nec peccare fecerim ex speciali providentia Dei in quibistum octibus turbibus a me habitus cum feminis. Quod concussionis et corporis tremoris cum pollutione sequuta attribuendi essent operationi de monis idioque absque peccato essent. Quod actus exteriores plexuam asculorum aliaramque orationem in honestarum essent supernaturalis in causa adioque a Deo et a Iesu procederant. Quod praedicta oscula et amplexus essent immunes a motu libidinis et essent a motiva maxime humiliationis ex supposita uniena cum Deo. Quod facta turpia cum femina complici procederant ex redundantia amoris urgia Iesum adioque a parte inferiore procederent et ex motu ipsius Iesu impellerentur. Quod stante supposita tam mea quam feminae clempissus unione cum Deo passit et truusque status componi una simulcum exterioribus actibus peccaminosis omnesque impulsus quos in eandam feminam habebam Dei et Iesu essent impulsus. Quod pessima doctrina a me insinuata Dei esset doctrina. Quod ad Deo haberem donum discretionis spirituum impulsus et illustrationis ad agnoscendum spiritualem anime stratum ipsaque spirituum discretio ac doctrinarum cognito esset lux mihi ad Deo infusa essem super omnes illustratus idioque essem omnibus superior. Quod facta turpia a me habita cum femina complici esset exercitium et martyrium ad Deo missum ad utriusque humiliationem et purificationem quod Deus sculando et emplectendo feminam complicum in me adessit Iesu ipsique Iesus mediante me ita agueret et loquetur. Quod stante dicta supposita unione cum Deo ab ipso mote essent potentiae miae memoria intellectus et voluntas ipsique Deus esset meus intellectus memoria voluntas et spiritus idque esset idem ac tres distinctae personae una majestas et unus Deus et alias crediti propositionis et dogmata mihi in processu contestata, quae quidem propositionis tanquam temerariae, erroneae, scandalosiae, Christianae, disciplinae, relaxative, mala sonantes periculose, presumptuose, errori proxime, abusive, verborum sacrae scripturae, injuriose, in sanctos, insane, sacrilege, heresim sapientis de heresi, suspecte impiae, blaspheme coincidentis cum propositionibus molinos et hereticae respective centurate et qualificate furent. Nunc de practictis eribus et heresibus dolens certus de veritate fide Catholicae corde sincere ac fide non fiete abjuro deteste maledico anathematizo et respective retracto omnes superdictos eros et heresies quos et quas tenui et credidi et promitto ad euro me nunc toto corde absque ulla hesitatione crederi et in futurum firmiter crediturum quicquid tedet credit predicit profiditur ac docet edam es Catholica ecclesia et abjuro detester maledico et anathematizo non solum supradictos errores et heresies verum tiam generalite omnem eliam errorem dicte sanctae ecclesiae contrarium omnemque aliam heresim et promitto et euro me neque corde neque voce neque scripto unquam recessarum quem cumque occasione sive praetextu a sancto fide catholica nec crediturum vel ad doctorum aliquem errorem idem contrarium su aliquam heresim. Promitto etiam me integre adim platurum omnes et singulus penitentius mihi a sanctitate vestra impositas sive imponendas et si umquam eliqui ex dictus meis promissionibus et juramentis quod Deus evertat contra venero me sub icio omnibus nis a sacris canibus a leisque constitutionibus generalibus et particularibus contra huius modi delinquentis inflictus et promulgatus. Sic me Deus adjuvat et illius sancta evangelia quae proprius manibus tengo. Ego Joseph Fernandez de Toro superdictus abjuravi promisi et me obligavi et ut supra et infidam veritatis praesentem schedulum mei abjurationes propria mea manu subscripsi eamque recitavi de verbo ad verbum. Rome in Palatio Quirinali hac die 17 Julii 1719. Ego Joseph Fernandez de Toro Episcopus abjuravi et supra manu propria. Appendix 9, prayer recited daily at opening of morning session. Biblioteca Nacional, Sesión de Manuscripto 500, 122, folio 1. Ad sumus Domine, Sancte Spiritus, ad sumus quidem peccate immanitate detenti, sed in nomine tuo specialitur aggregati. Veni ad nos adesto nobis dignari illabi cordibus nostris, doce nos quid agamos quo gradimus, ostende quid officere debiamus ut te auxilianti tibi in omnibus placere valiamus. Esto salus et suggester et effector judiciorum nostrorum qui solus cum Deo Patre et eius Filio nomen possidis gloriosum. Non nos patriaris perturbatoris esse justitiae qui summum diligis equitatem ut in sinistrum nos ignorantia non trahat, non favor infectat, non acceptio muneris vel personae corrumpat, sed junge nos tibi efficacitur solius tu e gratiae dono, ut simus in te et in nullo devimus a vero qua tenus in nomine tuo collecti, sic in cunctis tenem amus cum moderamini pectatus justitiaeque ut hic a te in nulle dissentiat sententia nostra ut in futuro pro bene gestis consequamur premia sempiterna. Amen. End of section 97.
Section number 98 of a History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Víctor Villarraza. Appendix 2. Abstract of the case of Catalina Matheo in 1591. Relación de las causas despachadas en el auto de la fe que se celebró en la Inquisición de Toledo, Domingo de la Santísima Trinidad, 9 días de junio, 1591 años. König, Universitat Bibliothek of Halle, YC 20 TI, see page 224. Catalina Matheo, viuda, vecina del Cazar, de edad de 50 años, fue presa por el vicario de Alcalá con 16 testigos de que en la dicha villa, de 4 años a esta parte, habían muerto 4 o 5 criaturas de muertes violentas, que era imposible haberlas hecho sino brujas, y de que la dicha Catalina Matheo y Olalla sobrina y Joana izquierda eran tenidas por tales públicas, y especialmente la dicha Matheo. Hízole proceso, y dióle tormento, y en él la dicha Catalina Matheo dijo que era verdad, que podría haber 4 o 5 años que Olalla sobrina la había dicho si quería ser bruja, ofreciéndole que el demonio tendría con ella acceso torpe, y que era buen oficio, y que una noche por medio de la dicha Joana Izquierda la había llamado a su casa, a donde estando todas tres había entrado el demonio en figura de cabrón, y hablando aparte primero con las dichas Olalla y Joana, las había abrazado, y después a la dicha Matheo, porque ellas le habían dicho que también ella quería ser bruja, y que el dicho demonio le había pedido alguna cosa de su cuerpo, y ella le había ofrecido una uña de un dedo del medio de la mano derecha, y que por regocijo del concierto habían bailado con el dicho cabrón, y él se había echado carnalmente con todas tres en presencia de todas. Y que aquella noche la dicha Olalla la había untado las coyunturas de los dedos de pies y manos, y en compañía del dicho cabrón habían ido a una casa, y llevando unas brozas en una teja habían entrado por una ventana a las 12 de la noche, y echando sueño a los padres con unas dormideras y otras yerbas puestas debajo de la almohada, les habían sacado una niña de la cama, y apretándola por las arcas la habían ahogado, y encendido lumbre con lo que llevaban, y la quemaron las partes traseras y quebrantado los brazos, y que al ruido habían despertado los dichos padres, y ellas se habían vuelto con el dicho cabrón por el aire a casa de la dicha Olalla, a donde se habían vestido y ido cada una a su casa, y que la ida y vuelta iban por el aire desnudas, y diciendo de viga con la ira de Santa María, y que de allí a pocos días el dicho cabrón había ido una noche a casa de la dicha Matheo, y hallándola acostada la había forzado y tenido cuenta carnal con ella, diciendo en esto algunas particularidades, y lo mesmo había tenido otras 10 o 12 noches, y en los dichos 4 años otras veces a menudo, y lo mesmo había hecho en las cárceles del dicho vicario, y que a cabo de algunos pocos días en casa de la dicha Olalla le había dado un cuchillo, y con él se había cortado la uña que le había mandado y se la había entregado. Y otras noches, untándose en casa de la dicha Olalla y en compañía de lo dicho cabrón, habían ido a otra casa y ahogado un niño y arrancándole sus vergüenzas, y después a otras 2 casas en diferentes noches, y ahogado otras 2 criaturas, y que una sola vez había invocado al demonio, diciéndole: demonio, ven a mi llamado y mandado. Y pasadas las horas del derecho, se ratificó en la dicha confesión, y el dicho vicario hizo acareación de la dicha Catalina Matheo con la dicha Olalla, y en su presencia la dicha Matheo le dijo todo lo arriba dicho, afirmándose en ello, y la otra negándolo. Y en este estado remitió a la dicha Matheo a este santísimo oficio, al cual, habiendo sido traída presa en la primera audiencia que con ella se tuvo, dijo que pedía misericordia del grave pecado que había hecho en levantarse así, y las dichas Olalla y Izquierda lo que de ellas había dicho y de sí confesado ante el dicho vicario, lo cual había dicho por miedo del tormento. Y habiéndose examinados 16 testigos en el Cázar, constó ser verdad que los dichos niños habían sido muertos, y se hallaron de la misma manera y forma muertos y maltratados que la sobredicha Matheo lo había confesado. Y habiéndose substanciado su proceso, fue puesta a cuestión de tormento, y habiéndose pronunciado la sentencia, y abajádola a la cámara para ejecutarse, antes de desnudarse, habiendo sido amonestada, dijo ser verdad todo lo que había dicho ante el vicario de Alcalá, y en efecto lo refirió en substancia, aunque en algunas circunstancias mudó alguna cosa, asegurando mucho ser verdad ansí en la manera del confesar como del jurarlo, y pasadas las horas del derecho, se ratificó en sus confesiones y en otras audiencias que con ella se tuvieron después, dijo lo mesmo, negando saber de que fuesen hechos los dichos ingüentos, ni haber tenido otro pacto tácito ni expreso con el demonio, más de que había dicho, y dijo las causas que había tenido de vengarse de los padres en la muerte de sus hijos, que son las mesmas que los padres testificaron, por donde sospechaban que ellas se los hubiesen muerto, y substancióse su causa, y votóse auto con coroza, levi, 200 azotes y reclusa por el tiempo que pareciere.
Appendix 3. Letter of the Suprema on the Tumult of May 2nd, 1808. Archivo Histórico Nacional. Inquisición de Valencia. Cartas del Consejo. Legajo 17, número 3, folio 31. See page 401. Las fatales resultas que se han experimentado en esta corte el día 2 del corriente por el alboroto escandaloso del bajo pueblo contra las tropas del emperador de los franceses hacen necesaria la vigilancia más activa y esmerada de todas las autoridades y cuerpos respetables de la nación, para evitar que se repitan iguales excesos y mantener en todos los pueblos la tranquilidad y sosiego que exige su propio interés, no menos que la hospitalidad y atención debida a los oficiales y soldados de una nación amiga que a ninguno ofenden y han dado hasta ahora las mayores pruebas de buen orden y disciplina, castigando con rigor a los que se propasan o maltratan a los españoles en su persona o bienes. Es bien presumible que la malevolencia o la ignorancia hayan seducido a los incautos y sencillos para empeñarles en el desorden revolucionario socolor de patriotismo y amor al soberano, y corresponde por lo mismo a la ilustración y celo de los entendidos el desimpresionarles de un error tan perjudicial, haciéndoles conocer que semejantes movimientos tumultuarios, lejos de producir los efectos propios del amor y lealtad bien dirigidos, sólo sirven para poner la patria en convulsión, rompiendo los vínculos de subordinación en que está afianzada la salud de los pueblos, apagando los sentimientos de humanidad y destruyendo la confianza que se debe tener en el gobierno, que es el único a quien toca dirigir y dar impulso con uniformidad y con provecho al valor y a los esfuerzos del patriotismo. Estas verdades de tanta importancia ninguno puede persuadirlas mejor que los ministros de la religión de Jesucristo, que toda respira paz y fraternidad entre los hombres, igualmente que sumisión, respeto y obediencia a las autoridades. Y como los individuos y dependientes del santo oficio deban ser y han sido siempre los primeros en dar ejemplo de ministros de paz y que procuran la paz, hemos creído, señores, conveniente y muy propio de la obligación de nuestro ministerio el dirigiros la presente carta
para que, enterados de su contexto y penetrados de la urgente necesidad de concurrir unánimemente a la conservación de la tranquilidad pública, la hagáis entender a los subalternos de ese tribunal y a los comisarios y familiares del distrito, a fin de que todos y cada uno contribuir, sic, por su parte, con cuanto celo, actividad y prudencia les fuere posible a tan interesante objeto. Tendréislo entendido, y del recibo de ésta daréis el correspondiente aviso. Dios os guarde. Madrid, 6 de mayo de 1808. Doctor Don Gab Nevia y Noriega, Don Raimundo Eltenhard y Salinas, Fray Man de San José. Rubricado, recibida el 9 de mayo de 1808. Su Santidad Bertrán Laso Acedo Encina. Ejecútese como su Altísima lo manda. Rúbrica, Valencia. Certifico el infrascrito secretario del secreto del Santo Oficio de la Inquisición de Valencia, que en el día 11 del mes de mayo del año 1808, estando en su audiencia de la mañana los señores inquisidores, doctor don Matías Bertrán, licenciado don Nicolás Rodríguez Lazo, doctor don Pablo Acedo Rico y doctor don Franco de la Encina, entraron en ella los ministros, calificadores, titulados, notarios y familiares que viven en esta ciudad, a los cuales, precedida convocación para este fin, se les leyó esta carta de los señores del Consejo de Su Majestad de la Santa y General Inquisición, y enseguida se les exhortó por el señor Inquisidor Decano a su más exacto cumplimiento. Y para que lo susodicho conste, doy la presente certificación que firmo en la Cámara del Secreto de la Inquisición de Valencia en el día 11 del mes de mayo de 1808. Don Man Fuster y Bertrán, secretario. Rubricado. End of section number 98. Section number 99 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Víctor Villarraza. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea. Appendix 4. Decree of Fernando VII, September 9, 1814. Restoring the property of the Inquisition. Archivo de Simancas, Inquisición, libro 559. See page 427. Excelentísimo Señor, por real decreto de 21 de julio último, se sirvió Su Majestad mandar restablecer en todos sus dominios el santo oficio de la Inquisición al pie y estado en que se hallaba el año de 1808, y que para la subsistencia y decoro de los ministros y demás empleados de sus tribunales se restituyesen toda clase de bienes y efectos pertenecientes a su dotación, como son frutos, créditos, réditos de censos, vales y caudales que se hayan impuestos en la caja de consolidación, así como de los rendimientos de las canongias perpetuamente anejas al santo oficio, afectas por breves apostólicos. Comunicado este real decreto al Supremo Consejo de Inquisición, para su observancia, consulto a Su Majestad lo que en su razón tuvo por conveniente al cabal cumplimiento de las piadosas reales intenciones, manifestando al propio tiempo los ruinosos y destruidos que se hallaban los edificios destinados al Tribunal del Santo Oficio, extravío de sus papeles más interesantes, ya de causas de fe, ya de la hacienda del Real Fisco, que fueron presa de los ejecutores de los decretos de abolición de los tribunales de Inquisición. Enterado su Majestad de todo y deseoso de llevar a debido efecto su citado Real Decreto de 21 de julio, ha resuelto se pongan desde luego sin demora ni detención alguna a disposición de los tesoreros de los respectivos tribunales de Inquisición todas las fincas y efectos de cualquiera clase que sean pertenecientes al tribunal y que en este concepto hayan sido secuestrados, confiscados, detenidos o aplicados a lo que se llama hacienda pública o nacional, devolviendo todos los títulos de propiedad y legitimación de créditos que hubiesen recibido y cortando la cuenta el día 21 de julio del presente año, den razón de las personas obligadas al pago de sus arrendamientos y obligaciones con expresión de sus cantidades y procedencias. De orden del rey lo comunico a vuestra excelencia para su inteligencia y puntual cumplimiento, y a fin de que esta real resolución la haga circular a los gobernadores, intendentes, directores del crédito público o sujetos encargados de la real recaudación de intereses en los pueblos de sus distritos. Dios guarde a vuestra excelencia muchos años. Madrid, 3 de septiembre de 1814. Señor Virrey y Capitán General de etc. Appendix 5. Decree of Supression, March 9, 1820. Miraflores. Documentos a los que se hace referencia en los apuntes histórico-críticos. 1.93. Rodrigo, Historia Verdadera, 3.494. See page 436. Considerando que es incompatible la existencia del Tribunal de la Inquisición con la Constitución de la Monarquía Española promulgada en Cádiz en 1812, y que por esta razón lo suprimieron las Cortes Generales y Extraordinarias por decreto de 22 de febrero de 1813, previa una madura y larga discusión, oída la opinión de la Junta formada por decreto de este día, y conformándome con su parecer, he venido en mandar que desde hoy quede suprimido el referido tribunal en toda la monarquía, y por consecuencia el Consejo de la Suprema Inquisición, poniéndose inmediatamente en libertad a todos los presos que estén en sus cárceles por opiniones políticas o religiosas, pasándose a los reverendos obispos las causas de estos últimos en sus respectivas diócesis, para que las sustancien y determinen con arreglo en todo al expresado decreto de las Cortes Extraordinarias. Tendréislo entendido y dispondréis lo conveniente a su cumplimiento. Palacio, 9 de marzo de 1820. Está rubricado al Secretario de Gracia y Justicia. Appendix 6. The last vote of the Supreme Council, February 10, 1820. Libro de votos secretos, Archivo de Simancas, Inquisición, libro 890. See page 437. Toledo, Don Manuel de la Peña Palacios. En el Consejo, a 10 de febrero de 1820. Señores Evia, Ettenhard, Amarilla, Galarza, Martínez, Veramendi, Prado. Hagan justicia como lo tienen acordado. Voto del Tribunal. En el Santo Oficio de Toledo, en 29 días del mes de enero de 1820, estando en la audiencia de su mañana el señor inquisidor, doctor don José Francisco Bordujo y Rivas, que asiste solo, habiendo visto esta causa contra don Manuel de la Peña Palacios, presbítero cura, que fue del lugar de Ontoba y actualmente de Torrejón del Rey en este arzobispado, por delitos de proposiciones y propagar doctrinas peligrosas contrarias al sentir de la Iglesia, dijo que su voto y parecer es que a este reo, a puerta cerrada, en la sala de audiencia y a presencia del secretario de la causa, se le reprenda, amoneste y conmine por las proposiciones propaladas ya en sus sermones, ya en sus conversaciones familiares. Se le absuelva ad cautelam y por 15 días se le ejercite espiritualmente en el convento de padres carmelitas descalzos de esta ciudad al cargo de director que se le señale. Se le advierta que por ahora le trata el tribunal con toda conmiseración y clemencia por habérselo implorado en las audiencias que con él se han tenido, y por esperar su total enmienda en el modo irregular con que hasta aquí se ha conducido con sus feligreses, y se estará a la mira de su conducta y operaciones, y antes de ejecutarse se remita a su Altísima con todos los expedientes que han precedido para su aprobación. Y lo rubricó de que certifico. Está rubricado don Domingo Sánchez Fijón, secretario. End of section number 99. Section number 100 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea. Appendix 7. Dictamen of the Consejo de Gobierno on the Decree Extinguishing the Inquisition. Archivo de Alcalá, Ministerio de Estado, Legajo 906, N88. See page 467. Señor Secretario de Estado y del Despacho de Gracia y Justicia, Excelentísimo Señor, he recibido el oficio de Vuestra Excelencia de 9 del presente con el proyecto de decreto en que se declara suprimido el Tribunal de la Inquisición. Se adjudican sus bienes y rentas a la extinción de la deuda pública y se fija la suerte de los dependientes del tribunal, cuyo proyecto remite Vuestra Excelencia de real orden al Consejo porque lo examine y exponga su dictamen. Enterado de todo, y después de una detenida discusión, ha acordado el Consejo manifieste a Vuestra Excelencia que reconoce la conveniencia de coadyuvar al sostenimiento del crédito del Estado por cuantos medios estén al alcance del Gobierno y reconoce asimismo que los bienes de la Inquisición, suprimida a lo menos de hecho por el rey difunto que nunca permitió que restableciese, podrán proporcionar algún auxilio a la caja de amortización sin agravio de nadie, pues en el proyecto de decreto se establece el conveniente para asegurar a los empleados del tribunal las asignaciones que les correspondan según sus circunstancias y clasificaciones. Por estas consideraciones, no haya reparo el Consejo en que Su Majestad apruebe en lo substancial el proyecto de decreto, aunque en su dictamen podrían hacerse en él las siguientes modificaciones. Primera, en la parte del preámbulo, donde hablando de la autoridad pontificia se usa de la expresión primado de la Iglesia universal, cree el Consejo que podría seguirse el uso constante de designar dicha autoridad pontificia con el nombre de Santa Sede o Sumo Pontífice, no porque el Consejo desconozca la propiedad del título de primado de la Iglesia universal con arreglo a los sacros cánones, sino porque en materia de denominaciones y fórmulas es siempre preferible el uso de las establecidas y más comunes que innovarlas, porque puede darse lugar a que se crea que la innovación envuelva algún designio que la malignidad interpreta según su antojo. Segunda, cuando en el artículo primero se dice que se declara suprimido el tribuno de la Inquisición, podrá darse motivo a que se infiera por esta expresión que el gobierno lo había creído subsistente hasta el día de derecho, cuya idea no aparece enteramente exacta, pues el señor don Fernando VII, resistiendo siempre a las gestiones de algunas corporaciones para su restablecimiento, y habiendo restituido a los arzobispos y obispos el conocimiento sobre las causas de fe que les corresponde por derecho común, dio bastante a entender que su real ánimo estaba decidido a la extinción de la Inquisición, aunque por ciertas consideraciones no la hubiere pronunciado más explícitamente. Cree, pues, el Consejo preferible que en dicho artículo se haga alguna mención de lo hecho por el difunto rey sobre esta materia, a que aparezca dicha extinción como un acto de la regencia en su totalidad, y si no juzga su majestad que haya necesidad de ello, por lo menos el Consejo cree que al expresado artículo convendrá añadir la palabra definitivamente, para que diga se declara suprimido definitivamente el Tribunal de la Inquisición. Tercero, el Consejo entiende que en la actualidad convendría suprimir enteramente el artículo cuarto por el que se autoriza al señor secretario del despacho de Hacienda para la pronta enajenación de las fincas, pues, habiéndose vendido muchas de ellas en tiempo del gobierno constitucional, y no siendo posible todavía hacer distinción alguna entre las que se enajenaron y las que no se enajenaron en dicha época, hasta que las Cortes examinen la grave cuestión relativa a los compradores de bienes nacionales, podría darse motivo a que se sospechase que se decidía este punto general por el presente decreto de una manera indirecta, mandando vender todos los bienes de la Inquisición indistintamente y sin hacer diferencia alguna entre los enajenados y los no enajenados. Parece, pues, que por ahora conviene limitarse a lo que se previene en el artículo segundo, aplicando la masa de los bienes de la Inquisición a la extinción de la deuda pública sin más explicación. Cuarto, el artículo sexto, en que se ordena que los sueldos de los empleados del tribunal se paguen del tesoro público, cree el Consejo que podría modificarse mandando que este pago se hiciese por la caja de amortización, pues no parece justo imponer este nuevo gravamen al Real Tesoro, cuando nada es más natural que satisfacer el gravamen vitalicio que pesa sobre los bienes y rentas del tribunal por el mismo establecimiento a donde han a ingresar sus productos. Esto no ofrecerá inconveniente aún después que se vendan todas las fincas que pertenecían a la Inquisición, pues siempre quedarán las 101 canongias de que habla el artículo tercero del proyecto, que no son susceptibles de enajenación, y con cuyo producto habrá más que lo suficiente para pagar a los cesantes del ramo, cuyo número se hallará muy reducido por los que han fallecido o pasado a otros destinos desde el año de 1823 hasta el día, y se reducirá todavía más por las disposiciones de los artículos 5 y 6 del mismo proyecto de decreto. Lo que por acuerdo del Consejo digo a vuestra excelencia en contestación a su citado oficio con devolución del proyecto. Dios, etc. Madrid, 13 de julio de 1834, el conde de Ofalia. Appendix 8. Decree of July 15, 1834, abolishing the Inquisition. Print by Castillo y Allenza. Negociaciones con Roma, Madrid, 1859. Tomo 1, apéndice, página 165. See page 468. Deseando aumentar el crédito público de la nación por todos los medios compatibles con los principios de justicia, teniendo en consideración que mi augusto esposo, que está en gloria, creyó bastante eficaz al sostenimiento de la religión del Estado la nativa e imprescriptible autoridad de los muy reales arzobispos y reales obispos, protegida cual corresponde por las leyes de la monarquía, que mi real decreto de 4 de enero próximo pasado ha dejado en manos de dichos prelados la censura de los escritos concernientes a la fe, a la moral y disciplina, para que se conserve ileso tan precioso depósito, que están ya concluidos los trabajos del Código Criminal en que se establecen las convenientes penas contra los que intenten vulnerar el respeto debido a nuestra santa religión, y que la Junta Eclesiástica, creada por mi Real Decreto de 22 de abril, se ocupa de proponer cuanto juzgue conducente a tan importante fin, para que provea yo de remedio hasta donde alcance el Real Patronato, y con la concurrencia de la Santa Sede en cuanto menester fuere, en nombre de mi excelsa hija, doña Isabel II, oído el Consejo de Gobierno y el de Ministros, he venido en mandar lo siguiente. Artículo primero. Se declara suprimido definitivamente el Tribunal de la Inquisición. Segundo. Los predios rústicos y urbanos, censos u otros bienes con que le había dotado la piedad soberana o cuya adquisición le proporcionó por medio de leyes dictadas para su protección, se adjudican a la extinción de la deuda pública. Tercero, las 101 canongias que estaban agregadas a la Inquisición se aplican al mismo objeto, con sujeción a mi Real Decreto de 9 de marzo último y por el tiempo que expresan las bulas apostólicas sobre la materia. Cuarto, los empleados de dicho tribunal y sus dependencias que posean prebendas eclesiásticas u obtengan cargos civiles de cualquier clase con sueldo, no tendrán derecho a percibir el que les correspondía sobre los fondos del mismo tribunal cuando servían en él sus destinos. Quinto, todos los demás empleados, mientras no se les proporcione otra colocación, percibirán exactamente de la caja de amortización el sueldo que les corresponda según clasificación que solicitarán ante la junta creada al efecto. Tendréislo entendido y dispondréis lo necesario a su cumplimiento. En San Ildefonso, a 15 de julio de 1834. A don Nicolás María Garelli. End of section 100. Recording by Víctor Villarraza. End of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles Lea.